So I think that DPS has been in a very weird spot forever, where it has been the role that everybody wants to play, and been the role that the majority of people want to main, and the role that everybody says, hey, pick this one up if you want to start to carry, which, everybody kind of wants to do in competitive. But along with that, it's kind of evolved to be the role that everybody really hates, and everybody just does not like the players coming out of this role. And in specific, a lot of support and tank players complain about the DPS players all of the time. And today I want to talk about why that is, in my own experiences, and why other people might not like the DPS role way too much. Now, before we really get started, I want to mention something right here that I thought was really kind of weird, and that is that it seems kind of counterintuitive that DPS would be hated by tank and support, because the entire purpose of tank and support is to help DPS, is to supply them with HP, with damage boost, with crowd control, and with some shield, with places to hide behind, with space, with all of that. So you'd think that, by supplying all of this, those players, that being the support and tanks, would really enjoy helping the DPS, because that's kind of their whole role, but that isn't really how it's been, and I think that is kind of a weird thing to kind of keep in mind as we're getting started here. Now, one big reason, though, that I think that a lot of people playing tank and support don't like DPS is that they do put in the best effort that they can. They do try to help these people the best that they can. But I think so many players playing tank and support have just been burned by their DPS players. And right here, I'm going to say that playing with a DPS essentially always leads to the grass is always greener syndrome, where you play your best as tank and support, and you think you're doing pretty well. You think you're helping your DPS, but your DPS is just not doing that great, and the enemy DPS is always doing better than your DPS. And then you go into the next game, and again, your DPS sucks compared to the enemies. And the next game, there we go, again and again and again. And I think that this, essentially the grass is always greener, even if you have a 50% win rate, it always feels like your DPS is doing worse, really is kind of what makes players not like DPS in the first place. It feels like you are doing your best, it feels like you are trying, it feels like you're creating space and creating heals and creating damage boosts, but nothing is being created out of that. No kills are being made, no damage, no picks, nothing. And I think that is probably the number one reason why so many people hate DPS players, because even if that isn't actually the case, it essentially feels like that is the case almost every single game, which isn't very good when you want somebody to like your role. Now, another thing that I want to mention right here is that I think a lot of people playing any role except for DPS realize that DPS is the carry role, and realize that they are, of course, supporting this role, and they are trying to help this role. And, we have the previous problem I just mentioned, but another problem that shows up right here is I think that a lot of people are essentially, maybe subconsciously or maybe consciously, jealous of the fact that DPS gets to do more, that DPS gets to finish up the kills, that DPS gets the benefit of their teammates. And I think a lot of people just think that DPS players are trying to take all the glory, that DPS players are essentially the higher class. And even though, when I was playing DPS, I never thought those thoughts. When you're playing one of these other roles, support or tank, it's easy to just kind of believe that the DPS think that they're above you, because sometimes you'll hear some that say stuff, and when you hear one person say it, you hear all of them say it. And even though, again, I say that the majority of DPS players are nice people that are doing their best to win games, yeah, you can easily come to see or come to think that everyone playing DPS is just kind of being a jerk about it, and just trying to put you down, and they want to be the one doing the best, not you, which shouldn't be how you think of it, but oftentimes, even for me, has kind of been how I think of it. And I think a thing I should also mention right here is that DPS does feel like a role where if you put in effort, you do get out result, and that's something to kind of be jealous of, I guess, because as tank and support, oftentimes you put in a lot of effort and you get almost no effect because your teammates aren't using it. If you're making a lot of good space with Reinhardt but no one's following up, you're being useless. If you're making a lot of good heals but people are just getting picked because they're going way too far out, so your healing's not really being effective, well, you can't really carry that. While if you are, again, playing DPS, you're almost always effective no matter what your teammates are doing. And I think people are kind of jealous of the fact that DPS players can do that, and that makes a lot of people kind of have some resentment for that role. Now, another thing I want to say right here, and that relates to the previous point, that I feel like a lot of players remember a few annoying DPS and then kind of apply that to all DPS players. And this is something that happens just everywhere in life. You can think of random situations. But in Overwatch in particular, I think this just happens like legitimately all the time. You have one bad game with one DPS player that's flaming you, or maybe even have a few. Maybe you have 10 or 20 experiences out of 100. or even out of 1,000. In that case, you'd still think that essentially all these DPS players are thinking this, that all of them are flaming you in their heads, and that even if they aren't talking, they're thinking that. And I think that that makes a lot of people kind of unhappy. Overall, at least in my experience, I've had more annoying DPS players than other roles, not by a huge amount, but you know, it's there. And I think that there is a reason for that, actually, and I want to mention that right here is my next point. Every role does have a good amount of players, you know, being annoying and being rude and all of that. That's just kind of how the game works. That's how online communities work. But I think that the type of player that is willing to actually play and main DPS does kind of essentially draw together a sort of community that are more competitive, that are more hardcore, I think should be the word, and that are really trying their best because they are picking up the role they can carry. They are picking up the role that everybody is putting their hopes up to. And by doing all of that and putting all that stress on yourself, or, you know, thinking you're all that great, you know, either of those, that can make you, I think, a little bit more toxic, and then that can lead to you being toxic in game, in chat, and then that can lead to people thinking that all DPS players are toxic because you are. And I think that's kind of how the hierarchy goes like that. Overall, I'm just going to say right here, if you're essentially playing Mercy and you get hated by a tryhard McCree one time, then you're essentially going to think, again, yeah, all McCrees are like this. All McCrees are dumb. All McCrees are just yelling at me. I'm going to mute voice chat, ignore all of them in the future. And I think that just kind of multiplies. You know, maybe not always to that extent, but at least to a much more minor extent. Stuff like that does happen in Overwatch with these roles. Now, another thing that I think is huge that makes a lot of people not like DPS players is that I think a lot of DPS players simply don't know how to utilize the other classes and how to actually make them be important as well. Because the other classes, essentially no matter what they do, are helping out the DPS, but the DPS can do a lot to help the other classes. The DPS can play up front and help the tanks. The DPS can play around the supports and help them. But more importantly than that, the DPS can realize that he can use the shield in a certain way to protect himself, while also dealing more damage, while also making the shield essentially more useful, while also protecting your tank, all depending on where you're standing. And I think a lot of DPS players don't really think about this way too much. And that is kind of annoying when you're playing support or playing tank, and again, you're out there, you're doing the best you can, but you do need your DPS to kind of back you up and to make you feel important, not even feel important, to make your character actually important and actually do what they're supposed to do. A lot of DPS, I think, just don't really know how to do this, and I think it's because a lot don't play the other roles. If you're a tank main or a support main, at least for me, the majority of them are more flex players than 100% one tricks, other than, you know, like Mercy mains and Winston mains for a while. But the majority of them will play the majority of the cast, at least a little bit. With a lot of DPS, though, you know, they're not willing to play any support or not willing to play any tank, which is alright, but what that does is makes that DPS players don't really know how DPS can benefit the other roles, because if you've been playing tank a lot, you can kind of understand where you want your DPS to be, and then if you switch to DPS, well, you know where to be, you know where to stand, because that's where you wanted your own DPS to be, so now you can be there. A lot of DPS, again, though, never will learn this because they won't ever play any other roles, and I think that really is a problem. Now, I'm not going to say, you know, you have to play every single other role in competitive, but at least in quick play, I think that could be nice, and the fact that a lot of DPS players don't do this is, you know, really frustrating as somebody that especially maybe knows, you know, better positioning for your DPS, and when they won't listen to that especially, that becomes extremely annoying. And here's my final point to why I think a lot of tank and support players hate DPS players. I think it's because there is just a far too large amount of DPS players in the game, which is, you know, just kind of how it is. The majority of the players want to play the role that can carry. There's a decent amount of players that want to play tank, a decent amount of players that want to play support. You know, that is in existence, but I think at least a slight majority do want to play DPS. And what this does is that it either makes really bad team comps, which will piss people off because, you know, 4 DPS team comps are just not fun to play with or against. Or on the other hand, what it happens to do is make so that essentially a player that wants to play DPS is now forced to play another role. They are now forced to play support, and they're now forced to play tank. And I know a decent amount of players that did go from DPS mains to other, you know, type of role mains because they were forced to do it because they can never get their role. And I think that's the #1 reason why you might hate the role, because being forced out of your job, the job that you think is the most fun, that you really want to do, yeah, that I think is definitely the worst possible thing you can do to somebody. And yeah, that works up in Overwatch as well. Now, I'm not going to say that that's way too many players, but, you know, I think that is still a pretty big thing because yeah, there's a lot of people that want to play DPS but simply just can't, because, you know, no role queue, no guild system, whatever, and just having to randomly fill does kind of put them in a bad situation. But anyways, there you guys go. Those are my opinions why I think a lot of tank and support players kind of hate DPS players. Again, I was thinking about it, and it is kind of weird because these roles are essentially made to help DPS, but yeah, there are a decent amount of reasons why you might not like them so much. With that all said though, guys, thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment down below your own opinions about this topic, hit the subscribe button or the notification button to see more videos like this in the future. As always, guys, thank you all for watching, and have a wonderful day.